Marcus and Angie, thanks so much for being here.
Lovely to be here.
Thank you.
You've both seen the good, the bad and the ugly of some family situations. Take us through, what are some of the messiest ones you've seen?
I think, unfortunately, the messy ones have come about, when families have not necessarily got an idea of exactly what is going to happen when mum and dad do pass away. And while it might be a plan in place, the actual implementation of that plan and how it's carried out and what's literally going to happen in those steps is probably not planned through or thought through enough, and that the whole team hasn't been involved in those discussions.
Yeah, I've had 25 years in banking. I've seen a fair bit before moving to the finance broker side of things, and I suppose some of the ones we've seen from an asset protection point of view, it's been quite well done, but from a business continuity point of view, it's lacking to the point where I've got one case where the asset protection was perfect, it was going to who it had to go to, but from a business continuity point of view, the son was continuing to run the operation, but all banking accounts had to stop straight away because it was going into the estate. So money coming in from grain sales could not be touched, and they had to find other ways to try and pay staff, to try and pay mortgage repayments and stuff like that. So it can get quite messy, and it's probably something that while we're out here talking today is to make an example of these sort of things so people can actually get it right.
Yeah, not the situation you want at all, right, guys?
No.
And I think, unfortunately, that is a situation where we see quite frequently, where bank accounts are frozen on the passing of one of, either mum or dad, and the business is really struggling to continue to trade through that, which usually has substantial expenses.
Yeah.
And I think that comes down to the detail. Again, that we've got a plan in place and we've got a great structure from asset protection, but we haven't gotten down into the nitty-gritty. I think, we definitely see that, unfortunately, with balance sheets and those dreaded financial statements, that often, what in there isn't actually given a lot of thought, and then when it becomes part of a bigger estate issue, those family loans and balances that sit there on the balance sheet that have been created by those mystical accounting entries each year become real assets and liabilities. And in the end, unfortunately, we've seen cases where amounts of money or assets have actually gone to family members where it was unintended, because overall, one party, whether it be the bank, the accountant, the lawyer, the financial planner, hasn't understood the full plan, and therefore has undermined that plan by, and unfortunately usually the accountant not knowing better, putting transactions and loan balances on the balance sheet that aren't part of the estate plan.
So this is some of the messiness, some of the ugliness, I guess, where things could end up, the unintended consequences. What should families, businesses look at doing to try and avoid any of this happening?
Look, from my point of view, and it's something I really want to stress, is don't just go to your solicitor to get stuff done, to get the estate planning done. You really need to involve from an accounting point of view, finance point of view, but also a solicitor that understands your industry, as well as the banking and the accounting side. All have to understand the industry, because there's a lot of pitfalls in it, and if it's not done right, there's some big consequences.
I mean, coming back to those horror stories where, we haven't, where we've seen that whole table of advisors haven't gotten together, or we haven't revised the plan frequently, ultimately we've seen where values have moved in properties or cattle, and the plan where one sibling was going to pay out another sibling ultimately just becomes unviable. And obviously, Marcus, you would see that from a banking point of view with serviceability.
You see it quite often from that point of view. Like you've got, say, a property's worth $10 million today, and that's when the succession planning's done, and it's all working out okay. One brother or sister is going to pay out the other party. Then you go down the line, it's 10 years or 15 years' time, and it hasn't been updated in that time, and that property's probably worth upwards of $30 million now, still generating a similar sort of income, but now they've got to try and pay $15 million. It's not going to work. So we're often involved and on a regular basis to make sure that that thing's updated and updated regularly.
How regularly would you advise people looking at, how regularly would you advise people to look at revising those plans?
From my point of view, I would say at least annually. It doesn't have to be a long discussion, but getting all parties, as I said before, your solicitor, your accountant, it could even be your financial planner, as well as your finance side of things, whether it's your banker or it comes down to the finance broker. I'd be doing it at least annually, and it can take it, because it's a review, it could be as much as an hour to an hour and a half, but at least you know everything's right and it's done continual.
And I think also, from my perspective, it just needs to be an absolute ongoing conversation. Are we buying a new property? Okay, how's that going to fit into the plan? How does that new debt fit into the plan? How does the ownership structure fit into the current, wills? All of those things. Any new venture has to be taken into account. A child is coming home onto the farm now, previously been away at uni or doing their own thing. Again, do we need to revisit the succession plan? So every time we're having a conversation with clients, we also need to be thinking the bigger picture. Okay, how does that fit into what mum and dad want from succession?
And ensuring, I guess, all the players' needs and wants are listened to, right?
Yeah.
As much as it can be, yes.
Succession, it's a fun word, isn't it?
Oh, yes.
Angie, you mentioned before about financial statements. How important is it, I guess, to keep your eye over those?
I think it's so important to have a constant, accurate balance sheet. Ultimately, we met with a new client recently. They want to start the whole succession process, even though they've got a fairly good idea of where they want to go. They've got siblings that are on farm as well as off farm doing their own things. We've got to take into account everyone's needs. The financials showed that the properties were in the trust, owned in the trust with the corresponding debt, and we were looking at the tax consequences if we bring in the on-farm sibling into some ownership, etc., only to find through discussion with mum and dad and then a title search that those properties are actually owned in mum and dad's own name. So had we started down the path of different options, it's really important to understand that the balance sheet is correct. And the balance sheet also showed that mum and dad were owed an awful amount of money, which now makes sense in the fact that those properties don't actually belong in there. They belong to mum and dad. So all of those things are so important, but also the balance sheet's historic, and often it's going to be recording the cost of those properties. Having a constant register of, what's the actual value? What is our asset value and our net worth actually worth today? That's going to make a big difference as well.
Do you have any other tips or tricks, particularly when it comes to dealing with rural property?
I think, ultimately we have to balance asset protection as well as what, the family want and complexity. I know I have so many clients groan when they ring and say, Ange, we're buying the neighbouring property, and I tell them they've got to put it in a new trust. And they're like, why can't we just put it in the same one? And I'm like, well, the tax consequences and stamp duty, etc., of moving those assets around as part of succession becomes a lot harder when we have them all mixed. So I think, again, when we're dealing with property, we have to think long term. And is it an intergenerational asset? Is it something that the family is going to hold on to, or is it something that they might trade out of to get into a bigger, more scalable property later down the track?
It sounds like here, guys, that so much of this is that communication's key, knowledge is key, but also not just thinking about now, but also the future and future possibilities. I guess to close, if there was some lasting advice you had to anyone in this space at the moment, what would you say?
Personally, I would say get it done and get it done now. But then for those that have got it done, review.
I totally agree. When we talk about estate planning, we always talk about if you passed away last night, you never know when it's going to happen. So, it pays to have everything in order now and get your whole team around the table. Get everyone talking and working together, and communication is absolutely the key.
Thanks so much for joining us on Beef TV.
Thank you.